Hello, everyone. I am so excited to be here with Ina Pinkney for World Polio Day here and in Philadelphia at the College of Physicians of Philadelphia here. We are really marking an important day of the year for Rotarians and everyone who's involved in the fight against polio. So stick around. You don't want to miss this episode.
Welcome to the Your Mark on the World show with your champion of social good, Devin D. Thorpe.
This episode is made possible via the support of our sponsors, including Johnson & Johnson's Caring Crowd. Ina, welcome to the show.
Well, I can't think of any place I'd rather be today than World Polio Day in Philadelphia with you.
Well, thank you, Ina. It is really an honor to have you on the show. You know, Ina, you are a living legacy in a way. Mm-hmm. Because you are a polio survivor.
1944, Labor Day. I was 18 months old.
You did not get polio in 1944 because you can't possibly be that old.
I'm 75 and a half.
Oh my heavens.
When you get to be this age, halves mean something.
Yeah. Well, I would have expected you had contracted polio a decade later, but that is remarkable. You know, when Rotary started with the Polio Plus program back in the mid-'80s, just about everyone in Rotary could identify a living relative or a friend who had survived polio.
Correct.
But that's not so anymore. There are relatively few because the vaccine came out in 55. And so very few people got polio after that at all. And so it's sort of a legacy that you represent. Tell us about your experience growing up with having survived polio.
Well, when I listened to the stories that my father told, and he was not one to embroider in any way, so I know I got the real deal. When he said he came into my crib to take me out and his outstretched arms, and I could not stand up to reach his arms, and he felt my forehead and knew that I had a fever. In that instant, he knew that the polio epidemic that was sweeping New York City had come to Brooklyn, New York, and he was terrified.
Yeah.
He went around the corner to our Dr. Suna, who was in the building. He held me tightly across his midsection so Dr. Suna could take a spinal. And Dr. Suna had a lab in his office, so he was able to identify it. My father took me to the hospital, and what he saw were children who were in isolation and in quarantine, and parents who couldn't see them more than once a week for maybe an hour through glass. And he said, I cannot leave my child here. His love for me was greater than his fear at that moment, and he took me home. And the March of Dimes put me in braces and said, well, we'll see what happens, we'll see what's damaged, and then we'll know what to do. And my father had read about 6 months later that Sister Elizabeth Kenny was in New York City. And she was an Australian nurse, and they called them sisters. And she had successfully treated an outbreak of polio amongst an Aboriginal people there. And he called every single hotel in New York City to find her. And when he did, he spoke to her assistant and said, I need Sister to see my daughter. And she said, well, what hospital is she in? And he said, no, I have her at home. And she said, I'm so sorry, but Sister cannot go to a private home because the doctors in New York have been so unpleasant to her and dismissive that she will only see a child in a hospital, so there is nursing around. And my father was very dejected, but did not stop, and the next day called her back and said, I will do anything. And she acquiesced, and my father borrowed a car, drove to Manhattan, picked up a very large woman with a very big hat who sat in the back and the assistant in the front. And when they got to the curb, she said, the child's doctor is here, yes? And she said, no, Dr. Suna is not here. She said, I don't leave the car without him here. And my father again ran around the corner and got him, and he escorted her into our apartment, a one-bedroom apartment in an apartment building. And it was at that moment, he said, that she cut off the cast that the March of Dimes had put on because I had a foot drop, and hurled it across the kitchen and said, this is not a broken leg, this is polio. And that began the hot pack treatments that I endured for a very long time.
Wow.
I know.
Do you have recollections of polio treatments as a young child?
I do, probably around 3 to 3.5, because my mom would lay down blankets on the kitchen table. My father had to get all wool blankets from the black market, St. Mary's all wool blankets, and cut them into the big strips, and then put them in the boiling water, and Mom with 3 pair of rubber gloves and wring them out, and wrap the wet, hot wool around my leg, and then dry wool strips, and then old oilcloth tablecloth, because we didn't have plastic in those days, and wait until the wet heat went in, and then cocoa butter and do the massage. I can tell you what that felt like. I can recall the hot wet on my leg, a leg made more tender each time, and the smell of the wool. I also can remember my little friends, who I was playing with. They would stand around the kitchen table and watch.
Yeah.
So 3 to 4, I can remember all of that.
I'm curious, because you contracted polio during FDR's presidency, did you feel a kinship to him, or was it still not known as you were growing up that he had polio?
I was too young to know then, but by the time I was 6, excuse me, I really did understand. I understood that this was bigger than just me in my apartment building. I was the only child in a building teeming with children to get polio. And so the guilt that my mother lived with, not knowing where she took me, where the other mothers didn't take their kids, no matter how benign.
Right.
As we know, even today, polio is a plane ride away if we're not careful. And so,
but then mothers thought polio came from ice cream, right?
ice cream, movie theaters, the air conditioning, don't be near people, don't go in a swimming pool, could be in there. Nobody knew anything. The fear was overwhelming.
They knew it came in the summer, so they associated it with summer things, right?
Exactly.
Such an interesting perspective. Thank you for sharing that. So you're a member of Rotary, passionate, proud member of Rotary. Rotary has been working on this, as I mentioned earlier, for about 30 years. Tell us about your engagement in that effort.
Well, just to put it in historical perspective for me, when Rotary began this initiative, I was starting to struggle with the late effects of polio, which nobody had identified yet. And I was having kinds of issues that didn't make sense to me. I was having sometimes a little swallowing, I was having a lot more pain, I was having a certain amount of fatigue. I couldn't quite put it together, and when a doctor would say to me, well, you're getting older, I would get, excuse me, I'm 40-ish, this is not, And I had heard about a conference in St. Louis, and I drove down to St. Louis, and I walked into a hotel ballroom where there were 350 people, all with the same complaints. And that was the first time we all began to understand that there were late effects of polio. So here's Rotary saying we have to get rid of this, and here are all of us saying, you're not kidding, we have to get rid of this, but don't forget us as well, because we're struggling with some things. And so this happened really at the very same time. Once I understood that this was going to be sort of the rest of my life, that I'd have to make accommodations, the only thing I could do was to get out and tell the story to Rotary. So if you have a Rotary club and there's 7 people in it and they meet for breakfast once a week, I'm going to go to your Rotary club and talk. And if you're going to do a tri-con and there's 700 people, I'm going to be there and I'm going to talk about this, because I understand donor fatigue. I understand that we thought when we hit $200 million that was as much money as the world has ever seen.
That's right.
And we were going to stop all of this, right?
With that $200 million,
Right. And so I understand donor fatigue. And so my job, as I see it, and my honor as I feel it, is to keep people motivated.
Yeah. Well, it is so incredibly important because, as you point out, until we have completely eradicated polio, it is one plane ride away for every child on the planet.
I know, people don't even get the enormity of that.
Yeah.
And I get very teary and very emotional when I think about how close we are.
Yeah.
I mean, to think that in my lifetime, I will see this.
Yeah.
I have lived 74 years with this.
Yeah.
And I want to see it gone.
Oh, yeah. Well, we are so close, incredibly close.
Yes.
And that is exciting. As you think about it, what are you most proud of having accomplished?
You know, I've lived an extraordinary life once I understood that I was different from everybody else and I was never going to fit in. I mean, between you and me, I had 21 jobs in my life and I was fired from 19 of them.
I love it.
I know. And, you know, I watch you on your show talking to people who are innovating in a way that helps the planet in new ways, like those young people who are drying rice. I was so moved by that, to think of that. And so I kept thinking to myself, I'm intimidated by that because I can't do anything that impacts people of such enormous amounts of people. But I can do things on a minute-to-minute basis that make a difference. So in my restaurant, it was very important to me that I never ever use styrofoam and that I never use foil, that we only use biodegradable boxes for to-go, that I went to pasteurized eggs because they were safer, because I went trans-fat free, and I inform my customers of all these changes.
Yeah.
So always, in my way, I tried to do the very best I could. And once I had time, then it was important to me to get out and talk to Rotary.
Well, you are an inspiration. As you think back on your experience, especially with Rotary, and this fight against polio, what's the most important lesson you've learned?
The most important lesson is that I go into a room and nobody in that room has polio or has had polio, that they may have an elder, an aunt, a cousin, elder who had that. And I talk to them about the magic of that and the miracle of that and how we cannot live as human beings if we don't see that in every country in the world.
Yeah, that is a vitally important lesson. There are certainly lots of polio survivors in the world who are not members of Rotary, who are not actively engaged in the fight against polio. Why did you feel personally responsible to sort of pick up this cross and bear it?
I learned a lot by the time I was 6 because I sat with adults and I learned adult conversation and I learned to be a committed listener. I also learned when they told me I was going to the hospital for my first procedure. Remember, I had listened to adults, and in 1949, when people went into the hospital, they didn't go to get better, they went to die. And so I thought they were taking me to die. But you can never have grief for a life not lived at 6. So I thought, this is what I get 6. And when I came out of ether, I thought, I have a second chance. And everybody in my life gets a second chance. But I have had a sense of, I was ready to die at 6, I'm ready to die every day, and if I don't give my life meaning and purpose and do what has to be done, I will never be okay. I learned to be kind because I knew that what the kids were doing to me at school, I would never do to another human being. So kindness is really what drives me.
No, that's profound. That is profound. Ina, what is your superpower?
Oh, I might have that Wonder Woman costume right under. I'm not sure. My superpower is that I'm fearless. I am never reckless, but I am fearless.
I love it. I love it. Ina, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
I can't imagine having more fun anywhere else.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's been a joy to have you, Ina. And we wish you every success in eradicating polio from the earth.
Thank you.
All righty. Let's do some good.
Let's do it.
At Caring Crowd, we believe everyone has the power to make a difference. Through our crowdfunding platform for community health, we empower passionate people to drive real change. Whether you work for a nonprofit organization, volunteer, or want to get involved for the first time, you can post a campaign on Caring Crowd. Join us, because caring is where change begins.
Thank you for listening. Devin Thorpe's mission is to end extreme poverty, improve global health, and mitigate climate change before 2045 by finding and sharing the stories of those who are doing the most good. You can join with other listeners to accelerate Devin's mission by visiting helpdevin.org right now.